Hello, and welcome to Cranfield University. In this interview series, we explore the role of philosophy and humanities more broadly in management, engineering, and adjacent disciplines. My name is Andrey Pavlov, and I'm a professor of strategy and performance at the School of Management.
Hi, I'm Toby Thompson. I'm a studio director here at Cranfield and also have a tremendous interest in the philosophy of executive education, late career executives, that is.
And our first guest is Professor Joseph Badaracco, the John Shadd Professor of Business Ethics at Harvard Business School. Joe, welcome. Welcome to Cranfield.
It's good to be here, Toby and Andrey.
Joe, can I just jump straight into what I find the most interesting and the most fascinating part of your work, and certainly what has been the inspiration for what I'm doing in this space at Cranfield, and that's your course, The Moral Leader. Can you tell us a little bit about how it came about, how you teach it, and what it's about in general?
Sure. It's in some ways a standard Harvard Business School course because we focus on making decisions. We want to help students make better decisions as a result of having taken the course. And there's a practically oriented framework for the course. That said, unlike almost every course at the school, we don't use case studies. I suppose everyone listening knows that a case study is a description of a manager and a problem, and that we lead discussions of what the manager should do. Instead, we discuss works of serious fiction, classic works, some contemporary works. Instead of 80-minute classes, we have 2-hour classes so that students can get into much more depth and, by the way, get to know each other a little bit better. And the framework for the course, this is my last observation, is that it draws very heavily on introductory moral philosophy rather than familiar business concepts. So serious literature, introductory moral philosophy, but with a decision focus and a practical orientation.
And how did this come about? How did you have the idea to do this in the first place? Because it sounds like a unique course.
I would love to take credit for the idea, but credit goes to a predecessor of mine named Robert Coles, the late Robert Coles. He had an extraordinary background. He was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist by training, was active in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and knew a number of important American novelists. And so he developed a course which he taught around the university and elsewhere based on fiction. And in the late 1980s, maybe it was the early 1990s, he was invited to teach his course at Harvard Business School. I heard about it. I sat in. It was a remarkable experience, 25 students. Robert Coles would come with a backpack, and he looked like somebody who was a tourist. As I mentioned, he was a psychiatrist by training. He would sit on the desk in the front of the room and say nothing and wait for students to talk. Over the course of 2 hours, he would interject occasionally. Maybe his training in psychiatry gave him special skills at doing this. But what struck me was the extraordinary depth of discussion. And by depth, I mean that with serious fiction, you get a view of the decision maker, the protagonists in the story. From the inside, you get a clear sense of what they're thinking and feeling and seeing as imagined by a brilliant writer. And I realized that was dramatically different from the standard HBS case studies.
Yes.
Which basically will say, here's a CEO or here's a marketing chief, and you fill in some of your prejudices about people who run marketing, and then you go on to talk about the Cabell asset pricing model or something. It was this powerful, in-depth view from fiction that made me really interested in doing my own version of the course.
Joe, we're going to come on to what the students think about the fiction, but how organizationally did you get away with doing fiction and not the Harvard case study method?
Well, Harvard Business School is a really big tent. pedagogically and in terms of research. We don't really have a research orthodoxy. And I think I never met any resistance. I had tenure, which also helps. But basically, I positioned what I was doing as a variant of the case method, simply with cases that had stood the test of decades or millennia in some cases. So they left me alone.
So can you talk a little bit more about some of these cases, so to speak? What do you teach, and what does the class look like?
Sure. The basic structure of the course says that, in effect, when you've got a difficult problem, you should think about it in three ways in terms of accountability. So which parties are you accountable to and for what? Since accountability gets complicated, you also have to think in terms of your judgment, which is asking about character. So the second part of the course focuses on character. And then if you have responsibilities for making things better, for making a difference, for meeting certain objectives, you also have to think pragmatically. So accountability, character, and pragmatism are the three big parts of the course. And then within each one, there is a series of books that will readings that will sort of elaborate on those. So let me just mention briefly, I introduced the course with a short story called The Use of Force by William Carlos Williams. He was a medical doctor in New Jersey, never left New Jersey, really. And in his spare time, he became one of the most important American poets in the last century. Use of Force is about a doctor who's called in late at night. It's a 3-page short story, late at night, to treat a little girl who may have diphtheria. And at the end of the story, the doctor gets a diagnosis in what, to the doctor and in many cases to the reader, looks like a violent assault on the little girl. He's got her tongue held down with a metal spoon. Her mouth is bleeding because he tried before that with a tongue depressor. And then you've got a paragraph or two of the doctor's reflections at the end. And this story is the basic course framework in essence. Who was he accountable to? Is he a good doctor? Is he a doctor on the edge? And did he do the right thing, or should he have come back? Had he come back later, it's not clear the parents would have let him in, because they were really reluctant to have their daughter treated, and she had a really bad fever and probably had diphtheria. So that sketches the course as a whole. Then we move to accountability. I'm not going to walk through the whole course, but just to give you a quick sample, the first discussion is actually nonfiction. It's excerpts from John Hersey's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Hiroshima, and it's basically supplemented by other readings about President Truman's decision to use atomic bombs at the end of the Second World War. The background readings are excerpts from John Stuart Mill and from Immanuel Kant. It's basically utilitarianism versus deontology. And we talk about Truman's decision, what he decided, whether there were alternatives, about the rights of the Japanese versus the rights of the American soldiers, the Allied soldiers, whether there were better alternatives. And then we sort of step back from that and ask from sort of a managerial point of view of the value of these two, fundamental philosophical perspectives. Next class, we say, human beings have limited decision-making skills. We need some help. It's pretty hard for us to understand, to do some grand utilitarian calculus. And we do have help in the form of what are technically called role obligations. And we discuss those. We've already talked about them with Truman, his obligations as American president, and the doctor, his role obligations as a physician. We talk about them with a book that I introduced about 25 years ago with trepidation. It's called Remains of the Day. It's the reflections of a British butler on his service in a great British home between the two world wars. And in this home, there were two important conferences aimed at averting the Second World War. This is really a book about the butler's high professional standards and the price he may have paid, as well as what he may have gained from adhering to these standards. And it turns out this question of high professional standards really resonates with students. So we go back and forth again between the story, the butler, and then thinking about role obligations more broadly. So in the rest of this first part of the course, we then move from role obligations to close associates, family, and friends. And are these obligations different from those that come with roles or come with universal principles like utilitarianism? In the final book, we use Antigone, and the question there is religion. And if you are religious or spiritual, what's the role of your religion, your faith, its precepts in making hard decisions? So that wraps up the accountability part. And at this point, accountability is quite complex. And so obviously you're going to have to exercise judgment. We then start talking about judgment and character. That part of the course starts with a reading that we use in every one of the 5 subsequent classes. It's extended excerpts from Aristotle, Confucius, and Nietzsche on the question of character, and excerpts from important interpreters of those 3 philosophers. And I'll mention just the first book in a little bit of depth because it's the one I introduced to the course most recently. It's called, and I recommend this book strongly. I guess it came out maybe 15 years ago. It's called How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia.
Very good.
And it's a very inventive read. It's overtly a sort of self-help book, but it's also a biography of an individual who goes from a poor village somewhere in Asia, looks like Pakistan, to extraordinary wealth, and then falls from the heights he has attained. It's written by a very highly regarded Pakistani author, and you really see the evolution of this individual's character throughout his life, and possibly even for a few moments after his death. So there's a peculiar sort of narrator. And that sets up the question of what counts as character, where does it come from, what role does it play in making decisions? And then we have 4 other books, Things Fall Apart, set in Africa, a little short story called Blessed Assurance, which is partly about race in America, Othello, and the classic American play, Death of a Salesman. Things Fall Apart is about what is a moral code. Blessed Assurance, what is integrity? Othello is about the malleability of character, because you see this great soldier, after a couple of weeks of manipulation, killing his new wife. And Death of a Salesman is about the role of dreams and aspirations in character. And then just briefly, we move to the final part of the course, pragmatism. The reading there is about half of The Prince. The first class, we discussed some of Lincoln's decisions during the Civil War, where it looks like he was Machiavellian. And the question is, was he a great president despite or because of his Machiavellian tendencies? And perhaps we shouldn't regard him as great because of these tendencies. The next book is Katharine Graham, the CEO, first female Fortune 500 CEO, deciding whether to publish the Pentagon Papers, very controversial in this country about 50 years ago. And then we end up with A Man for All Seasons, the Robert Bolt play about Sir Thomas More, St. Thomas More, and the decisions he made in his ultimately futile battle with Henry VIII over Henry's marriage plans. So that's sort of the course, big categories, moral philosophy readings, but applied to this inside perspective you get from works of serious literature.
It sounds, Joe, you would have a riot of opinion around all of those things. I'm thinking about a canon, and I'm thinking about freeing people from simplicity. It sounds like you're not content to put a simple model forward. You want it complex.
Absolutely. What I tell students, maybe a third of the way in the course, is that I view, and the serious literature views, morality is something that is fundamentally, inescapably complex. It's multifaceted, and that it's typically a mistake to take one moral element and use that as decisive in the kind of decisions we're looking at. You know, we're looking at so-called gray area decisions. Obviously, if the question is, should you steal money from customer accounts, at FTX and use them to pay off debts from another part of your organization, that's clearly wrong. It's overdetermined. It's wrong on a variety of moral and legal counts. We're looking at gray area, and the first warning is just don't oversimplify.
And this is, for me, I think, where good literature or good works of philosophy are so superior to standard cases, where the cases are written specifically to illustrate a point or illustrate a perspective. And so it's, in many cases, they're sanitized. Whereas
Yes.
if you see the characters struggling with a moral dilemma, situated in the complexity of their social and geographic and historical position, you just know that there's no right answer in many cases. There's no single answer.
Yes, I sort of come out of the closet early on and reveal my own sort of philosophical
Well, that's interesting.
inclination. So if I had to pick a school, it would be American pragmatism.
Mm-hmm.
And I quote one of the founders, William James. I think he says this in his book, Pragmatism. Facts are good. Facts are indubitably good. Give me plenty of facts. And principles are good. Give me plenty of principles. And that's basically the approach we take in the course. In addition to that, what students see is that each of the protagonists and each of the students in the class look at these things differently. So to some extent, what is right in a situation partly depends on who is deciding what the balance of principle is, what the critical facts are, what's going to work and what isn't. So this isn't pure moral relativism. We're talking about which moral principles are decisive given the nuances and facts of a situation and given how I see my responsibilities. But there is no right answer that emerges from these discussions and from these books.
One question that I have, I suppose, is so what is the interaction like? What's happening in the actual classroom, especially if you start with such a powerful story? So you come in, they have read the story. What's going on there?
Well, unlike Robert Coles, I do start with a question. Like Robert Coles, I sit on the desk through the whole class and I never write on the board. So I really do want to signal that this is their discussion. But I will ask a loosely structured question to start most classes. So coming back to the doctor, I literally say, what are your reactions? What did you feel about this doctor? What were your reactions to him? And a follow-up, maybe after 5 minutes of somewhat discursive comments, is if you had a child, would you take your child to this doctor? And in the process of students talking about that, typically, they've said something about him as a professional. Is he meeting his responsibilities? They've said something about his judgment. Maybe they've said a little bit about whether he had any choice about going ahead in the fashion he did. And then I'll say, well, you've raised a number of important issues. Let's talk a little bit about who was he accountable and for what? And he's got professional standards. He's accountable to the patient, but she's a little girl, so there's accountability to her parents, who are her parents and her guardians. And so that gets that ball rolling down. Sometimes I'll take an incident from a book and say, what were you thinking or feeling as you read this incident? That said, that's how I start the discussion. But what's remarkable in these classes is to see the reality that of the story and the reality of the decision that the students conjure up from their reactions. And I will call attention to how they how some of them seem to be seeing the story. And I'll ask if others see it the same way, if we need to qualify that view, if there are other views. But I really do try to rely on the classic student-driven case method once we get beyond my little sort of toe in the water sort of introduction.
And are the debates heated? Are they reflective? Do students end up shouting at each other in the heat of the moment, or?
You know, there's very little of that. And I tend not to encourage it. I think, as I said a moment ago, that we are dealing with inescapably complex issues. And what's important for students, not just in the discussion, but later in their lives and in their careers, is to see the complexity and to understand other perspectives. And so I will often ask, how would we qualify this? Did some of you feel differently about this? Are we missing something? And you will often get some really good comments, and I'll go back to the person who made the initial comment, and we'll have a little back and forth, but the aim is sort of working together to display the full complexity rather than to have a battle or to reach some sort of resolution. And let me just add one other thing. I typically have 70 to 90 students. And I'd say that virtually every year there are 3 to 5 of them who come into class and make comments as if they have actually met personally the character in the story. So there's a complete suspension of disbelief. And so they speak in this personal way, this authentic way. And those are wonderful voices. And I don't want people arguing with them. I want people trying to understand those perspectives.
Do you ever have, Joe, students wanting the truth? I know you talked about pragmatism, and I came across something recently. Stephen Colbert mentioned truthiness, which I'm sure Rorty would really like, where it just sounds a bit true. Do you ever have students saying, well, Joe, what is the truth with this case or with this story?
No, but what they do want is my perspective at the end. Mm-hmm. And so what I will typically do is spend about 10 minutes at the end giving some of my perspectives on their discussion based on some thoughts that I've got ready, that I've prepared. I don't necessarily use everything I prepared. I'll use some of the things depending on what the discussion has been. And then at the beginning of the next class, I'll make some more comments. And by the way, I teach this, it's a seminar, so it meets once a week. And students are doing 18,000 other things in the interim. So I need to connect the dots, sort of string the pearls. And so I'll spend another 10 or 15 minutes going back. And so I will give them some of my own perspectives about what I see or some of the important issues, some of the important questions to ask, maybe some things that are outside the text when you've got nonfiction like Truman or Katharine Graham's decision. So I will fill some of that in. So that may put some boundaries and give a little shape to the discussion, but that's about all they get from me.
Mm. What do you think they get out of this course? And also, what do you get out of teaching it?
Good question. I'll speak for myself. We have lots of remarkable students, I think, coming to MBA programs these days. And they bring a wide variety of backgrounds. And I simply enjoy hearing some of these. And I know it's a cliche that every time you read a classic work or hear it discussed, you get a new perspective, but I often do. And when we're having a really good discussion, I will often hear a topic that I knew was somewhere in the story, but had never really been discussed. and I'll let it run a little bit. So this last semester, this was about a month ago, we were discussing Katharine Graham. As I mentioned, she was the first CEO of a Fortune 500 company. She became CEO because her father had started the company and built it up. She'd heard it discussed at the dinner table. She'd worked there as a summer intern. But then her husband, who was a brilliant individual, became the publisher of the Washington Post. And then he was a brilliant guy with profound psychiatric problems. And he committed suicide in one of their homes. And then she stepped in as publisher. So she was in this very difficult position in many ways when she was making this huge, almost bet the company decision on whether to publish these papers with opposition from the Nixon administration, and the New York Times had already been enjoined in New York and told not to publish. She was way out on a limb. So somebody said that we're seeing this discussion in a different way because she's a woman and not a man. And that has occasionally come up, but this was said with conviction. So I said, are there any other thoughts? And there was a sequence of 5 or 6 really thoughtful comments, different facets of how we might be seeing her, how she might have seen herself, how all the male executives around her might have been seeing her, given her gender. So those were great discussions. I went back, I took a few notes, and next year I'll probably, when I summarize it again, I'll take credit for some of those really good observations. What do the students get? I think they see each other in a very different light. These aren't the consulting firm skills of analysis and articulate presentation. You get to see who else is sitting in the classroom with you and who you're sharing other classrooms with. I think a lot of students who get to really good MBA programs and a lot of other top programs, spent their lives since very early on building resumes. And I don't think they've had the time to think through some of these issues that are, they're kind of philosophical, they're personal, they're religious, spiritual. They have a need, but they haven't had the opportunity. And I think they really appreciate getting some structure on these issues. And I'm not a fan of a lot of simple structures, that start with some alliteration, the 4 L's of something or other. So I think that when they really confront these classic ideas in the form of important literature, they're getting something of real value, and they recognize that. You've always got the question of the half-life of a course. Who knows? But I think this is probably a little more radioactive with a longer half-life than some of the other things.
And have you seen it evolve, Joe, over the years? Is it a case of adding to that canon of works, or do you see new directions for the course?
There's deficiencies in the course. With all due respect to Cranfield, there is too strong an Anglo-American bias here, okay? And I've got too many male authors. There's a big world out there, and I've looked for more diversity. So every spring, I get recommendations for books. My wife will make recommendations. But as I said, the last one I introduced was about 5 years ago. That was How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. The course has a very tightly interwoven structure of ideas. And there's just so many ways in which I can now help students go between this text, the next text, and the structure of ideas, that when I try to insert things, it's been very hard. Now, I did have a very strong advocacy this last summer of Henry IV, Part 1.
Wow.
And I got an extended email describing all the ways in which this raised profound leadership issues. So I put the book in, and then late summer, early fall, I was very early fall, I said, you ought to read it and just make sure. And it was essentially impenetrable. It's a history, and Shakespeare supposed familiarity with the previous histories. So I yanked it out and put Othello in. So I'd love to diversify in a variety of ways, but I haven't been able to do so. And the students really, really like the course as it is. And, I think there's a lot of innovation that takes place that's really just doing something different. And it's not better. And there's a lot to be said for going way down an experience curve and doing something well. So that's kind of where I am.
How do these ideas transfer to other courses? So the MBA is, in a way, it's a great vehicle for trying something like this. But of course, you're teaching on other programs as well, and you can't help but think in that way. So how do you take it to other audiences?
Good question. What I will do with some of the cases and some of the discussions that I teach in the first year. So I teach another course in the first year that's called Leadership and Corporate Accountability. So this is a required first year course. That means there's 30 sessions, give or take. I'm one of 10 instructors, so it's taught in all the sections. And so when I wrap up a discussion, I will sometimes refer to an issue or a perspective on an issue, or sometimes I'll even use a passage from one of the books that comes from my second year elective. And it's usually really effective, especially the passages, because as you can imagine, some of them are just so beautifully crafted. The language captivates, the ideas interwoven captivate. And if it's relevant to the discussion we've had, students will lean forward in their seats a little bit. We have teaching group meetings before each one of these cases. So the 10 of us who are teaching the course will get together, and I'll offer some of this to them. But that's about as far as I go. This first year course, Leadership and Corporate Accountability, very managerial, basic business law, occasional, and it's got an ethics framework, but it's very, very managerial. We've toyed with the idea of inserting fiction, but I'm not sure it would work.
Well, it's a great idea.
I have a self-selected group in the second year.
Yes.
And that makes a big difference.
Yes. So the moral leader is an elective then?
It's an elective, yes.
Yeah.
I got a question then. To what extent, Joe, do you feel trepidation to somehow decolonize the curricula, to use a trendy term? Are you worried about integrating, let's say, world literature or world examples for which maybe you don't know the detail that perhaps you should?
I'm not worried. Having taught as long as I have, I've developed, I think, exemplary skills at faking it. We have so many students with amazing backgrounds. They come from all around the world, or they've lived in different parts of the world, or their families have come to America from different parts of the world. So I'm quite willing to defer to them. And other students are really willing to listen to them on things that may have to do. I mean, if you take How to Get Filthy Rich, I'll usually have a student or two from Pakistan or South Asia. And I'll say, is this an accurate portrait or a demeaning portrait of life in your country as you see it? And you'll get some mixed responses, thoughtful, on the ground responses. So that really isn't a problem. And the other answer to your question is that it's the power of literature, and that carries the day. It creates a reality, a plausible enough, sound enough reality, an engaging enough reality, and students enter it. It's a little metaverse, if you will. Students enter, and they're okay in it for a while, so long as we're not overtly offending anybody or conspicuously omitting some aspect of reality. Another
question that I have, I suppose it's a broader one, kind of stepping back from just these courses and talking about teaching moral reasoning and thinking about moral reasoning in general. Toby and I were talking about your two most recent books, Stepping Back, I think it's called.
Yes, Step Back, yes.
Step Back, and Managing in the Gray. Can you talk a little bit, I suppose, about these books, but also about how, in your mind, what you're writing in those books and the research that you did for those books coheres with what you do on the MBA program?
Yes. Well, let me start with Managing in the Gray, because that book very much is a result of having taught this course and having taught the first-year course, Leadership and Corporate Accountability. So it focuses really on gray area managerial problems. There's no literature in it. But the framework for thinking through these is fundamentally basic moral philosophy. The idea in that book is that when you're at work, and you could be heading a team, you could be running a global company, and a gray area problem lands on your desk, you should work the problem as a manager. And we all know what that means. You get data, you get the right people, you have good candid meetings, et cetera, et cetera. If you still don't have the right approach, you decide as a human being. And I try to flesh out in that book what that means to decide as a human being. And there I come back to utilitarianism, rights and duties, issues around character and pragmatism. So that book is really, I don't know exactly what you call it, but a pretty close spin-off of what I've been doing for a couple decades in the literature-based course. Step Back basically was a way of answering a question that I should have asked a long time ago. You know, we all teach these courses and we counsel students or executives sometimes, and we tell them to reflect. But we never say what that is, and we never tell them how they're supposed to find time to do it. So I interviewed 100 people, basically in businesses from entry level to CEO, and said, for you, what is reflection? Do you do it? How do you do it? And I described that in this little book. The main idea of the book is that they rarely go up to the mountain and do classic reflection, you know, long periods of tranquility and peace. They do typically what I called mosaic reflection and little bits and pieces of time. And so I've worked on that book maybe over the last 6 or 7 years. I think it was published a couple of years ago. And since then, I've brought out the theme of reflection in the Moral Leader course, because several of the books are first-person accounts. And so you can see the protagonist reflecting. The use of force, the doctor is very compelling first person. Remains of the Day, the British butler, he's reflecting first person on his life as he looks back on it. And then I use Antigone here. Students will read Antigone and they'll kind of ignore the chorus. They'll look at the battle between Creon and Antigone, okay, which ends up with bodies all over the stage. They won't pay attention to the chorus, but I'll ask about the quality of reflection. And it's the chorus that I view as a real exemplar of good reflection. They think in religious terms, spiritual terms, historical, psychological. They look at the nuances of what's transpiring on the stage, and they go back and forth. And it's this back and forth movement when you face complexity that I think really is the heart of good reflection. And so then we carry that theme forward through the end of the course, because we've got a couple of other books that are first person, you know, Catherine Graham having to decide, do we publish this thing tomorrow? Do we publish it the next day? Or do we do what our lawyers and finance people say, which is wait until the court reaches a final verdict? So
I can't help but see Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks in that same role, Joe. I,
It's
I, I,
great move.
it's a great move. I interrupted you there. I know you talk about Marcus Aurelius and Michel de Montaigne and Ignatius Loyola in that Next Step book. And you're talking about reflections there. Are you advocating detachment of some sort when you talk about reflection, like a Stoic detachment?
Well, no, I'm really advocating a more limited and more frequent kind of detachment, which is just trying to find a couple times a week, maybe once or twice a day, where for 5 minutes or so, you step back from the torrent of things you're dealing with and try to look at the important ones and reflect a little bit on how you're handling them. Marcus Aurelius is an interesting example of this because he wrote the Meditations while he was not just a Roman emperor, but he was leading Roman soldiers up north of Italy, beyond the north of Italy. And I mean, Italy didn't exist. Nothing existed then, fighting German and Germanic invaders. And so he wrote a little bit in the morning, a little bit in the evening on parchment. It's amazing that we have anything he wrote, that any of it has even survived. And he was just stepping back occasionally and briefly, giving himself a little guidance or trying to learn from what had happened. And that's very much this mosaic approach. And I do say that, and the folks I interviewed said the same thing, that from time to time, you do need to step back further and take a half an hour on a weekend or sometime and look at how work is going, look at your big decisions, look at life. But day by day and week by week, it's stepping back briefly. In whatever mosaic pattern works for you. That was the other extraordinary thing, that everybody created their own approach. There were some remarkably different approaches. And so part of the advice in the book is look at what they did and what works for you.
To me, this process of stepping back, or as you said, finding your own way of having a practice of stepping back, to me, that's a way of training your judgment muscle, so to speak, training your capacity and capability to exercise judgment and moral judgment, in particular, I think. And you're right. It might be to go back to Toby's mention of Ignatius Loyola. It might be a 10-minute examen at the end of the day, or it may be just something in the morning. Or sporadically throughout the week, as long as, I suppose, to me, what's really important is that it's consistent. It's never let out. It's never left.
That's right. And with thinking about Ignatius Loyola, one of the remarkable things about him is he's, known, of course, as founder of the Jesuits and author of the Spiritual Exercises. But the Jesuit order expanded rapidly throughout Europe and then outside Europe during the last 20 years of his life. It's been characterized as the first really successful global organization. And he managed it from the center by writing letters and occasionally sending out or receiving Jesuit emissaries from the global operation. But he had, of course, personal standards that he wanted to meet. As somebody running, if you will, this organization, and of course in terms of his own faith. And so that's another thing, that when you step back occasionally, you sort of have to ask yourself how you're measuring up by whatever those standards are, your standards and those that you've told other people you're going to be meeting for them. So there's a lot to be learned by looking at some of these classics of reflection from this pragmatic perspective.
Joe, tell us more about your current work, your current thinking.
Well, sure. What I was aware of, or became aware of, was that in neither of the courses I've been teaching, so the first year one that's a little more business law oriented, and the second one that's literature oriented, I never really say anything to students about how they should make what you might call the final decision. So you've used all the frameworks, you've reflected, you've stepped back, you've done all of these wonderful things. You're still not sure. And tomorrow you've got to decide, either because there's a deadline or you realize you're just going in circles. There's other things you got to do, got to decide. How do you make the final decision? And so the idea I'm working with now is the idea that you make that decision essentially by deciding. In other words, at the end of the day, what you don't learn what's right by looking at the frameworks, by consulting your mentors, by looking inside at your moral compass. It's not written anywhere. It's not going to be told to you. A little voice called your conscience isn't going to whisper it to you. I mean, if your conscience had been whispering the right answer, why were you going back and forth? Was it whispering something different in the morning versus the evening? And so ultimately, I'm going to argue, I think, that you're deciding, and you have to think through three things. Factually, what facts in this situation do I believe are critical? Secondly, morally, what moral principle or what moral perspective do I think is central? And there's a vast collection of choices, okay? And then what's going to work? What do I think is a path forward for myself and others? What do I think is going to work? So you think hard about those three, and then in some way that we do not understand, you simply decide what is right. So as I think about this, I often come back to a little tale. It's apparently an ancient story. I think Wikipedia traces it to ancient Hindu teachings. So there's this guru, and a young man comes up to the guru and says, "What holds up the earth?" And the guru says, "A very strong man holds up the earth." And the young man goes away. This can go on forever. I'll make it succinct. Young man goes away, thinks, he comes back and says to the guru, "Well, what holds up the strong man?" Guru says, "Well, he stands on the shoulders of this immense eagle." Young man says, "Thank you." He goes away, comes back, he bows. "Oh, master, what holds up the eagle?" The guru says, "The eagle has his claws, gripping the back of this immense turtle." This time the young man doesn't leave, and he says, "Oh, master, what holds up the turtle?" And at that point, the guru says, "Look, kid, from here, it's turtles all the way down." And at some point, you decide. And if you go to contemporary neuroscience, contemporary social science, classics of literature or spirituality, no one will tell you how these final decisions are made. And we don't know how our brain makes these final decisions. It's a black box, or so I'm inclined to think. So you've got to be careful that you put the right things into your black box. What do I believe is important? What do I believe is right, morally important? What do I believe is going to work? And then you make a decision, and then you act on it. So that's kind of what I'm working with now. We'll see what comes out.
Very interesting, because of course it also means, it implies that there is no way of avoiding responsibility for the decision that you make.
It's yours.
Yes, it's yours.
Yes, it is yours. You can go to your mentor, and you should go to a mentor if you've got one, okay? And mentor seems to likely to understand the situation you're facing. Talk with your mentor. But then, and you could even follow what your mentor recommends, but you are deciding to follow your mentor and not yourself. This is inescapable. The personal decision in the end is inescapable.
Joe, is there a perfect audience for these sorts of things? There seems to be a need for quite a bit of maturity, intellectual, moral maturity for some of the things you're saying. Who's it aimed at?
Well, that's what publishers often ask. And I think no one really comprehends the magnitude of contemporary economies. You know, you can throw around a $20 trillion US economy, whatever the GDP number is. It's incomprehensible. And there are hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people running organizations of all different kinds. And there are a lot of people who struggle from time to time with these issues. So they're out there. They have a need to get some sort of guidance. And there are lots of different folks who are trying to provide this. So those are the folks I'm trying to get to. It's really hard to do these days. It's always been hard. I think social media makes it even harder, and I don't really know what the answer is, but I do know the need is out there.
Mm. Do you think we should teach moral reasoning on the undergraduate level as well?
Very carefully, very inventively. So I've found that whenever I get to, this is decades ago, whenever I would try out role utilitarianism or rule utilitarianism versus act utilitarianism, the Japanese have a saying, you can feel the air in the room. I could feel the air leaving. I feel I was losing attention. Mm. You've got to really put moral fundamentals in front of students, and in a decision context where the principle seems unambiguously relevant. So Truman arguably could have saved or did save hundreds of thousands of lives, not just American soldiers, but also Japanese soldiers and Japanese civilians, even though he killed 200,000 Japanese children and parents. And many of them were innocent. It was wrong. And he later said it was wrong. He said he couldn't stand the thought of killing all those children. So it's got to be relevant. And this little short story of the doctor, this question of, did he think about the child's rights or what was right for the community with a diphtheria outbreak? You got to make these principles sort of relevant and show their illuminating power. Otherwise, and they are powerful, but that's where the art and the imagination really comes in to sort of, what you got to do with moral philosophy, I think, is to really simplify and then exaggerate and dramatize and hope a little of that sticks.
So I suppose what we are kind of on a global scale, or on a big scale, I should say, in order not to imply geography here, but what we are trying to do is really think about the role of philosophy and of humanities in the professions such as management, engineering, medicine, defense. You have spent decades thinking about these issues, at the intersection of humanities and business. If there is one thing you could leave us with here, what would that be?
Well, what I'd leave you with is something that's easy to say, easy to prescribe. I think quite hard to do. But I think that, as I've said at a couple of points, I think for a lot of young men and women, as well as sort of the folks mid-career who come to our executive programs, yours and ours and others, and who are getting professional training of different kinds, there is an increasingly unmet need for powerful guidance, philosophical, religious, spirit, whatever amalgamation you want to describe, for ways of thinking about themselves, their lives, and their decisions. And I think that there are valuable ways of taking professional courses and interjecting small but powerful elements of fundamental moral philosophy into these courses. And, you know, when people typically think about moral philosophy, you know, they sort of round up the usual suspects, and you can do the little drill of deontology versus utilitarianism, and rights and duties on the one hand, and consequences on the other are important. Okay, let's stipulate that. But
Yes.
moral philosophy in terms of these issues of character. So if you've got to put hard decisions in front of people, and these can be engineering decisions, they can be finance decisions. And then you've got to say, how would you personally make this decision if you were making it? How would someone who you respect professionally make this decision? And then what do you think about these one or two bits of guidance from this great reservoir of classical thinking around integrity or malleability of character, or the moral power of Machiavelli? What do you think about this bit of guidance that has the mandate of centuries or millennia? Is that helpful? That could be a 10-minute part at the end of a class. And I think something like that done over the course of a semester could lead to something of value. So I think in terms of imaginative course creation or course improvement, I hope there's opportunities there.
So do I. Joe, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Excellent questions. I hope the answers are helpful to folks listening.
Thank you, Joe, so
Absolutely.
much.